When Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu made plans to address Congress, it was President Joe Biden who was running as the Democratic nominee for president. But when Netanyahu speaks on Wednesday to Congress, the political constellation will be quite different. In fact, there are hints that a President Kamala Harris might be tougher on Israel. Let's watch this appearance in March.
People in Gaza are starving. The conditions are inhumane. And our common humanity compels us to act. And the Israeli government must do more to significantly increase the flow of aid. No excuses.
Our next guest, international relations expert and Harvard professor Stephen Walt, has argued against the mainstream consensus when it comes to the Middle East. He and his co-author John Mearsheimer made a splash in 2006 when they criticized the Israel lobby in the U.S. and the influence they believe it has over foreign policy. Stephen Walt joins us now to discuss Netanyahu's visit to the United States. Welcome to Rising, Professor.
Nice to be with you.
Yes, thank you for joining us at this very interesting political moment. Joe Biden, still the president, obviously, but not going to be the candidate any longer. There was question of whether Biden, Kamala would be meeting with Netanyahu. What is at stake in this visit? How is the U.S.-Israel relationship potentially going to be impacted by Kamala stepping up into the presidential candidacy slot and possibly the presidency in November?
Well, I don't think it's going to have a dramatic impact on the U.S.-Israeli relationship, which is, reinforced by a whole variety of political forces. Kamala Harris has been slightly more critical of Israel's conduct in Gaza than the rest of the administration, but she certainly hasn't been as critical as people like, say, Senator Bernie Sanders and some other members of the Democratic Party. I don't think you're going to see a huge amount of daylight here. In terms of the political stakes, the stakes for Prime Minister Netanyahu are primarily his own domestic political survival in Israel. And I think his main motive for wanting to come to Washington is to try and convince Israelis that he's still the best leader to deal with U.S. leaders. His problem is that all of this has been overtaken by the political events here in the United States. So the visit's not likely to get the same degree of attention that it might have absent President Biden's recent announcement that he was not going to run.
Now, a lot of people have compared the U.S.-Israel relationship to the relationship the U.S. had to South Africa when it was an apartheid regime, being one of the last countries to call what was going on in South Africa an apartheid. They had Nelson Mandela listed as a terrorist. And now we're at this point where the international community has absolutely called Israel an apartheid state, called for the end of the genocide in Gaza, called for the arrest of Netanyahu. Do you see any potential lane for someone like Kamala Harris, who's taken a lot of money from the Israel lobby, who is outspokenly pro-Israel, to say it's okay to have Zionists want to live in Israel, but it can't be an apartheid state, and it can't be under the extreme right-wing rule of Netanyahu, and they can't push native Palestinians out? Do you see that being possible in the near political future at all?
Actually, I don't. I think you do see lots of things shifting, more fundamental forces, particularly a generational change here in the United States. And of course, what's happening in Gaza has altered a lot of views, sort of exposed exactly what's been going on there for many years. But again, the support from groups like AIPAC is still pretty critical to American politicians. I think the main institutions in the Democratic and Republican parties are going to remain strongly supportive of Israel. What you may see going forward is American support being somewhat more conditional, where the United States begins to condition some of its assistance and, for example, the protection we provide in the UN Security Council on greater Israeli progress towards a genuine two-state solution. Now, the Israeli Knesset just passed a resolution last week saying that they were firmly opposed to any kind of two-state solution, which, of course, is directly at odds with what stated American policy is. So that tension is going to exist. It's going to exist regardless of who the next president is. And I think we're going to see some incremental changes, but not a sea change anytime soon.
In Israel, it seems to me that there's been and continues to be tremendous popular support for, if not for Netanyahu himself, obviously he's a controversial figure who faces a lot of political and legal challenges in Israel, but there is support for continuing the war against Hamas until a point at which Hamas is either eliminated or surrenders or gives up the fight from their side. There's support for continuing to do that. Whereas in the U.S., there's, you can argue, rising support among some certainly many on the left, even some on the right, for disinvesting the U.S. from this war effort, or saying that the aid, as you pointed out, could be conditional on making some kind of agreement between Israel and Hamas to end the war. But my point being, the U.S. still so far apart from not just what Netanyahu wants, but what the people of Israel want and what the policy is likely to be, even if Netanyahu is no longer in charge. Is that not the case?
Well, there's not been a lot of daylight between what the Israeli people say they want and what the Biden administration has been doing for Israel. We've been providing the military means for them to wage the war. We have not tried to shut that off. We've protected Israel diplomatically. We've, protested or cast doubt on the decisions of the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. So there's not a lot of daylight between the U.S. government and where the Israeli people are. The difficulty that the United States and the Israeli people have is that the war in Gaza is not going to solve the underlying political problem here. They're not going to be able to eliminate Hamas completely, and they're certainly not going to be able to eliminate the Palestinian desire to control their own fate, to have their own state, to be able to govern themselves. That's not going to be solved by this war, and that's certainly not going to be solved if the war expands, which is still, unfortunately, a possibility. Finally, this does put the United States in a very awkward position because not only are we defending a set of policies that are not morally justifiable, but it does have significant strategic consequences for how the United States looks to the rest of the world and costs the United States a considerable amount of prestige, say with the global South, but also in some parts of Europe as well. So it's a policy that's both a strategic disaster for the United States, but also morally tarnishing as well.
Now, we saw Israel pull a tactic that they've used time and again. This is not new, but when a lot of America was distracted, the news cycle, everyone was paying attention to an attempted assassination of former President Trump, we saw the bombing of Yemen by Israel. Israel has taken credit for it. And in response, we've seen reporting that Putin is now considering providing arms and material support to Yemen, essentially putting the United States in a proxy war with Russia. How does this change anything, if at all, about Netanyahu's visit?
I don't think it's going to make much difference. I mean, the purpose of the visit, as I said before, was for him to sort of bolster his standing among Israelis. He also, I think, wants to make Israel's case in front of a friendly audience. All the people there are going to be generally supportive of Israel. He's going to defend what Israel's done there. He's probably going to try and thank Congress for providing the additional assistance that it has authorized throughout the war. So I think the developments in Yemen are worrisome. It's not surprising Israel retaliated to a Yemeni drone strike. The difficulty, of course, is that what the Houthis in Yemen are doing, attacking shipping in the Gulf, attacking Israel to the extent that they can, is a direct consequence of the war in Gaza. And the way to get those things to stop, the way to actually cool things down with Hezbollah in Lebanon, is to actually have a ceasefire that ends the conflict and begins to move us towards a political solution. And until that happens, problems in Yemen, problems around Israel are going to continue.
What is the situation in Gaza right now? We haven't done an update on this in a little bit. Can you describe some of the ongoing horrors and destruction? I mean, is there any building left standing? This has been going on for so long, such a complete campaign of bombing and destruction.
what is happening there is horrific. And if it were happening anywhere else in the world, the United States would be moving heaven and earth to stop it. And we certainly wouldn't be arming those who were conducting it. So it really is, quite a departure from what Americans like to think are our values. There are probably at least 40,000 Palestinians have been killed. Up to half of them women and children. There's a study from the British medical journal, The Lancet, that estimates the number of people killed maybe far in excess of that, maybe closer to 180, 190,000 people. And I think over time, of course, it's going to become increasingly clear just what the human consequences of this had. So there's no question that Israel was entitled to respond after Hamas conducted its illegal attack way back in October. The problem is its response has been both disproportionate, horribly disproportionate, arguably genocidal in character, but also is not going to solve the underlying political problem. So it's both brutal, but it's also at some level politically pointless. And that's not something the United States should be backing.
And Israel's in a bit of a bind right now. They've been cut off from their access to coal, which is an energy source that they heavily rely on from the nation of Colombia, which sells it to them. We also are in this place where there are a lot of reports of Israel running out of weapons. Now, the conventional arms transfer policy that the United States has, it says the United States will not give arms to human rights violators. We've also had members of the State Department say they don't agree that Israel is a human rights violator. They don't agree with what the United Nations is up to. They don't agree with the ICJ or ICC. These are things the State Department has said before. But is this an example of very effective propaganda? Because the same aggressive and egregious human rights violations we're criticizing Russia for in their actions in Ukraine, Israel can be guilty of in Palestine, in Gaza. Do you think that, there's going to be a fracture in this? How much of it do you see as, relying on this Christian nationalist view that Israel is a nation enshrined by God, that a lot of members of Congress like Burchett, like Lauren Boebert, they really believe this as well? That's a hard ideology to crack through. But among average Americans who don't prescribe to those more extreme views of religion, do you think there's a world where they break through this propaganda?
Well, I think, for most Americans don't care that much about foreign policy and may not be paying that close attention, even given how vivid and dramatic and horrifying these events have been. But I think what you're pointing to is, again, the cost the United States is paying overall. The United States has benefited from the sense broadly in the world that it maybe stood for positive values, if not always as consistently as we would like to. But the contrast between the position we have taken in Ukraine, understandably, and the position we are taking with respect to Gaza is not lost on other people around the world. And particularly in countries that have a history of colonialism, who have an image of the world that, sort of Western powers are always imposing their will on others. What's happened to the Palestinians resonates very strongly with those populations. And when the United States is clearly guilty of double standards here, we pay a political and diplomatic price for that. Now, we're a great power. We can sometimes ignore what the rest of the world does, but it does make the rest of American foreign policy more difficult to transact. And it's one of the reasons why the United States has had trouble getting much support outside of Europe for the policies we've adopted towards Ukraine. And I think that lesson is becoming obvious to more Americans, and it's something that, the next president, regardless of who it is, ought to take seriously.
Professor, thank you so much for joining us. Stephen Walt, we really appreciate it.
Nice talking with you both.